And Sudhanshu Jain has a lot of great experience in this area. He's trained as an engineer. He designed integrated circuits for 25 years, but in 2008, he made the choice to retire early, and he decided that the impending climate crisis was more important than this work that he was very qualified and very skilled at doing. And he decided to volunteer on mitigating climate change. He's recently been elected city councilman for the city of Santa Clara in California. With Citizens Climate Lobby, he meets regularly with members of Congress to advocate for a national carbon tax. He serves on the board of Actera, a 51-year-old environmental nonprofit. And he and I co-wrote the Jain Declaration on the Climate Crisis, which is available at the JAINA website, and we'll send that out. Sudhanshu has been vegan since 2010 after attending an anniversary celebration at the Jain Center of Northern California, where we had a lot of vegan speakers. So I'm going to turn it over to Sudhanshu to tell us more. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Gina. I'm going to share my screen now. And can everyone see this?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, very good. Yeah, I'll just dive into this. I think Reshma did a great job talking about the health impacts of veganism. So I'm just going to talk about sort of the environmental impacts, climate change, so on. All right. So the world is getting hotter. If we look at this graph here, what you see is we've had thermometers since the 1880s, and we've been tracking average global temperature. And you can see as we really started burning a lot of fossil fuels in the 50s, 40s, 70s, the temperature has been rising. And what we see here is 2014 was the hottest year on record. Then 2015 was the hottest year on record. And 2016 was the hottest year. And then 2017 was not as hot as 16 because 2016 was what we call an El Nino year. So those years are excessively hot. So if we continue with that and update it to 2020, what we see is here's 16, 17, 18, 19, and 20. So 20 is almost matching the hottest year on record, and 20 was not an El Nino year. So, so the impacts are devastating of climate change. You know, people say that Texas froze, and so maybe there's no global warming. Well, the reason why Texas froze a couple of weeks ago is because what happens is the poles are really cold, and there's a jet stream that goes around, and that jet stream that goes around holds the cold air up in the Arctic. But when the Arctic gets warm, the jet stream weakens, and that cold air is allowed to droop down into southern latitudes. And so that's what happened with the polar vortex that caused Texas to freeze. And these climate events are very expensive. In 2019, one hurricane alone was $25 billion. It hit the Bahamas, and it actually reached 180 miles per hour winds, and anything above 157 miles is a Category 5 hurricane. So now there's impacts on our global stability. So the United States Army War College does reports talking about the impacts of climate change on our military. And what they actually concluded was the US military could collapse within 20 years due to climate change. And that's because the US military has to respond to various threats, severe weather events, mass migration, diminishing fresh water, changing disease vectors. What happens is as temperatures get warmer further north, certain mosquito varieties and certain diseases are able to flourish at higher latitudes. And so where it's not as cold anymore. So now we're seeing Zika and dengue and West Nile and other diseases coming to the United States. Then we have, of course, the stress on the US power grid, which we realized in Texas. And there's nuclear power plants. So what happens is, as you get these big flood events, you can flood out, like in Fukushima, a tidal wave flooded out the generators for the nuclear power plant. So, and sea level rise. So the report not only concludes that climate change is real, but is on track to create an unprecedented catastrophe that could lead the total collapse of US society. So that's how big a threat this is, okay? There's a very well-known environmentalist, Paul Hawking and Tom Steyer. Everyone knows Tom Steyer, who is a hedge fund investment manager. He's gotten very involved in climate change and politics. And so Paul Hawkins went and he wanted to look at what are the things we can do to avert climate change that are cost effective and most impactful. So they didn't have very much money. So they went to about 200 scientists and researchers at various universities. And what they did was modeled and analyzed 100 ideas to find out which are the most impactful. And what they concluded was actually, if you look at this list, refrigerant management, which is the types of refrigerants we use in our air conditioners and refrigerators, would be the #1 most cost-effective and impactful. But then number 3 and 4 are actually reduced food waste and plant-rich diets. So the amount of food waste is incredible in the United States. And that's not only in agricultural processing, but just in people's homes. And the amount of waste that people buy these big quantities at Costco, and then they don't use all that food, and so it goes to waste. And then a plant-rich diet. So, so this is our CO2 emissions, and we're emitting about 37, 38, it's now up to maybe 40 billion tons of CO2 into the atmosphere every year. And what we see is this is the historic contribution of greenhouse gas emissions from CO2. And we can see all different sources of fossil fuels are increasing over time, but coal is still the bulk of it. And then this is how much is contributed by oil, and then gas, cement, and flaring. So now if you look at this is greenhouse gases. This is CO2 equivalent. So that's up to 55 billion tons, because that includes other things like fluorinated gases, nitrogen oxides, and methane. CH4 is methane. So here you can see the amount of methane that's released. And this is from agriculture and livestock. So you can see it's a substantial portion of the emissions. And this is an interesting chart. This shows greenhouse gas emissions, CO2 emissions per country. This is total emissions. And then this is per capita here on the right. And what you see here is this is China. And this top line is the territorial. So China emits a lot, but a lot of that CO2 is related to products that they produce. So these are goods that are exported. So it's not consumed by their people. So here you can see that what's consumed by the people is less than what they export. The US is the opposite. We consume a lot of CO2 and we don't produce as much because we're buying a lot of this stuff from China. So, and this is per person, per capita. You can see the US completely dominates per capita over India here. So, we're responsible for the bulk of the per capita emissions based on our lifestyles. Okay, so now let's look at our food choices. So the World Water Institute released a report called Livestock and Climate Change. And what's interesting here is various estimates estimate that livestock contributes 18%. But the World Watch Institute, when they looked at it more carefully, they said that it actually contributed over 50%. So 51% is the total greenhouse gases attributed to livestock products. So there's different ways to look at it. This has been somewhat controversial, but it's at least 20% of our emissions is from livestock. So Now, what we see here is that the world's appetite for animal protein is destroying the Amazon. So the Brazilians are burning down the rainforest. And what we see is under the new president of Brazil, Bolsonaro, he has just turned a blind eye to all of the illegal burning of the rainforest. And here's a slaughterhouse, and cattle ranches account for up to 80% of the deforested land in the Amazon. And so that's changing global climate patterns. It's creating desertification of the Amazon. They're now getting droughts because the trees aren't emitting all of that moisture into the air. So, so the thing is that we are actually in what's called the 6th major extinction event that we know of over history. This is over billions of years. And the last major extinction event was that meteor that hit the Gulf of Mexico about 65 million years ago and wiped out all the dinosaurs. So now we're in this 6th major extinction, which is actually caused by human activity. And it's actually estimated that half of all plants, animals, and birds on the planet will die off before 2100. And Jains have animal sanctuaries and are concerned about animal welfare. But when we have droughts and wildfires, the painful deaths of all of these animals due to climate events is should be of concern to all humans, and particularly Jains. So this is a graph of the extinction events. So this is the 65 million years ago. This is the meteor event. And then we've had other major extinction events. And these are defined by over 30% of the animal species are lost due to some event. These could be super volcanoes or meteors. We don't really know what the history of these are, but the 65 million years ago, it's pretty clear that was that meteor that hit the Gulf of Mexico. So now let's look at our carbon footprint. So you can go and use a calculator and look at your carbon footprint. But we see that the bulk of our emissions are due to our transportation choices. This is our cars and air travel and so on. And then housing, to heat our houses and have electricity in our houses. And food is the 3rd largest. And so your food choices can have a fairly substantial impact on your carbon footprint, your impact. So a typical US household emits 48 tons of CO2 per year. And so let's look at your food choices here. What you'll see here is that this is CO2 equivalent. And you can see a meat lover has about 3.3 tons of CO2 per year of their emissions. And vegetarians are half of that. So you can see that just your food choices would reduce half your CO2 emissions. And vegans are just a little bit more than that, or less emissions. So now let's look at your individual food choices. So what we see here is lamb has a very high, this is kilograms of CO2 per kilogram of food consumed. So that's 40 kilograms of CO2 per kilogram. And you can see beef is next, but look at cheese here. Cheese is pretty high. Milk here is very low because milk is mostly water. So a kilogram of milk is mostly a kilogram of water. So, but you can see as you drop down to plant-based foods, you're way lower on the emissions per kilogram. And then you're also eating lower on the food chain. So you're getting less of the bioaccumulated toxins that you would get from eating animal proteins. So, so there's now a lot of amazing replacements for foods that otherwise you thought you would have to get from animal sources. I make this really great vegan chocolate chip cookie, and I use flax seeds as my egg replacer. So 1 tablespoon of flax seeds with 3 tablespoons of water to replace 1 egg. And so, but you can also buy egg replacers that have tapioca or potato starch. And then there's a new product which is made from plants. It's from pea protein, just eggs. And you can make scrambled eggs if you want. And they have other products that you can replace with scrambled eggs. And there's mayonnaise, which is vegan. So, and you pretty much can't tell the difference between the real products anymore. So this is kind of amazing to a lot of people. And that is that India exports a lot of beef. And Gina and I, we went to meet Professor Jain in Kensington, and he was just shocked. Everyone thinks of their, family cow that is well treated and lives a great life. And what we find is that, like the United States, India is moving into these concentrated farming operations. And India actually exports a tremendous amount of beef to the rest of the world. So it's this basically tied for second now. And there's almost 1 billion cattle worldwide. So if we look from dairy is producing almost a billion tons of CO2. And so India, of the amount of milk produced by cows, India produces the most, about 20% of the world's supply, okay? And so dairy accounts for 2% of US greenhouse gas emissions. There are 278 million dairy cows. So it was 1 billion total cows and livestock, but it's almost 300 million dairy cows in the world and almost 10 million in the US. And the thing is that 1 gallon of milk, as Reshma had talked about, has a tremendous amount of impact because it takes 144 gallons of water to produce 1 gallon of milk. Most of that is to grow the feed. And it takes 100 pounds of feed every day for a cow. And then for dairy alternatives, there's just an unbelievable number of dairy alternatives. I mean, I think at this point, there's no excuse. If you want milk for your chai, you can try almond milk, you can try oat milk, you can try pea milk, you can try flax milk, soy milk. There's just an unbelievable number of things. A vegan yogurt that I like is this Kite Hill. It's made from almond milk, and I think it's pretty much equivalent to any cow milk yogurt that I've found. And then this Miyoko's cultured vegan butter is pretty much indistinguishable. That's what I use in my chocolate chip cookies. So, and the chocolate chips in the chocolate chip cookies are vegan. It's very easy to get vegan chocolate chips. So, so I think that, just try all of these different varieties and find one that you like for your chai. So now if we look at the source of protein in diets of Americans, what we find is, basically, if you look at it, just this much is non-animal protein, right? This is actually flesh. And then you have eggs and dairy. So you're really up to, 90% of the protein comes from animal sources. And if you split up the animal flesh part of it, it's divided into beef and chicken and so on. So, and the reason why I mention this is because there's a guy named Pat Brown, and he was a Stanford professor of bioengineering, biomedical, and he wanted to he took a sabbatical and he wanted to solve the world's biggest problem. And he thought that the world's biggest problem was actually our consumption of animal protein. And it's causing deforestation of the rainforests. And so he said, and he had been to a lot of these climate change conferences, and he'd go and he'd talk to these people all day about climate. And then at night, they'd go out for dinner and everyone would order a steak. And he's like, these people must surely realize that animal protein is the cause of a lot of our climate destruction, but people are just so addicted to their habits of eating, what they've always eaten. So he said, okay, I'm going to create a product that is meat, but it doesn't come from animals. And what we find is that he created the Impossible Burger, and some of you may have tried it. A lot of people say they can't even tell the difference. But if you look at the impacts, eutrophication is actually when you have the runoff of fertilizers from fields, or you have animal waste that gets into the water stream and goes into the oceans, that creates a fertilizer that causes these algae blooms that eliminates all the oxygen. And then you have all these fish dying. So eutrophication is the fish dying from the runoff. And so you can see that aquatic eutrophication is, 1/12 of what it would be from a beef burger, of the Impossible Burger. You see global warming is 1/9. Land occupation is 1/25. Water consumption is 1/7 the amount of water, okay? And so this is the Impossible Burger. And friends of mine who have tried it, they've said, and I've eaten them, but I've never eaten beef, so I can't really say, but they say that it's pretty much the same. What you see is it has the same amount of protein. It has the same amount of calories, actually fewer calories, less fat. It does have more sodium, but it has iron, and it has a lot of B vitamins and so on. So it's very nutritious from that standpoint. So, when we look at the research on, whether people are interested in trying plant-based meat, and you just look at Americans, almost 30% of them just have no interest in trying that. And this could be because they just, think it's too processed, or they just don't want to eat meat. But there aren't 30% vegetarians in America. And so some people are not sure of trying it. Some people want to try it. Some people have tried it. So this category is just, I believe, our cultural addiction to the foods that we've always eaten. And that's Pat Brown's experience. And so to some extent, we just give people, alternatives, like dairy alternatives that look like the thing that they're used to, but it just doesn't come from animals, okay? So if we look at the cost of climate change, it's extremely expensive. I talked about the one hurricane being 25 billion, but if you look at 2017, we had 3 major hurricanes. Hurricane Harvey was estimated about $100 billion. Hurricane Irma was about $64 to $92 billion. So just in that year alone, we had almost $250 billion worth of damage to the United States of the hurricanes. And so when we look at all the climate events, not just the hurricanes, we're looking at about if you estimate it, based on flooding and heat events and things, the cost to the US economy is $240 billion a year over the past 10 years from climate events. So now if you look at sort of people's perceptions of climate change over time, so Yale has a program on climate change communication, And what they have been tracking is how concerned Americans are with climate change. And so it's gone from, in 2015, that 11% of the people were alarmed, this like hair on fire about climate change. And fortunately, it's increased to about 26%. But it goes up and down to some extent. And so we see that people who are concerned about climate change hasn't really changed, okay? And people who are cautious about climate change has actually gone down. So the good thing about it, people who are dismissive, these are people who just deny it, has gone down from 12% to 7%. So our goal is to try to get more and more people to get really alarmed about climate change and make the changes that you can in your lifestyle. That is, as we reduce the amount of fossil fuels in our electric grid, then you should consider using non-fossil fuel sources for your home heating. I have a heat pump water heater that runs on electricity that's equivalently efficient to a gas water heater, and it doesn't create, and I have carbon-free electricity in my home. So, and so that's pretty much all I had. So I'm gonna turn it back. I'm gonna stop sharing here and we can go to questions, I guess. Okay.
Thank you so much, Sudhanshu. Really, really informative. That was chock full of good information for all of us. And to transition us over to questions, I'm going to introduce Saurabh Dalal. He'll ask some questions and facilitate some more from the audience. So Saurabh Dalal is from Washington, D.C., and he is a longtime vegan who's been involved in outreach, education, and advocacy for many, many years. He's been vegan since 1991, vegetarian before that his whole life. He volunteers as a board member or advisor to the board for many organizations, including the International Vegetarian Union, the Veg Society of DC, and farm animal rights movements. And he's been very active in JAINA and Jain-related projects. He works as an engineer and a consultant to the city of New York. And with all that, I'm going to turn it over to Saurabh to post some questions and pull some from others. So everyone else in the audience, please feel free to post any questions in the chat.
Hi, thank you, Gina. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. All right. Hello, Jay Janendra to everyone. I also want to thank Sudhanshu. What a great presentation and really informative. I think we've given our presenters a major challenge by, putting everything they can in about 20 minutes. So I thought that was really good. So I want to just monitor the chats, and if anyone has questions, I'll look at those as I pose the first question. And so Sudhanshu, you mentioned a couple of the studies, and there's a lot of great work that's been done to talk about, human-induced greenhouse gas emissions. And you mentioned some of the numbers in a couple of the, studies that have been done, FAO, as well as researchers from WorldWatch. Can you give us a sense of really what's sort of like that range of estimates overall of greenhouse gas emissions that are human-induced? And what's your opinion of the best number to use? And maybe if you can just tell us a little bit more about why you think, what are people discounting or counting? Any information would be helpful.
Yeah, so, pretty much all of these greenhouse gases are human induced. They're either cutting down the rainforests, which are actually absorbing CO2. It's that land use that has an impact. But it's just the bulk of it is the burning of the fossil fuels. And we just have to stop. We're trying to stay below 2 degrees Celsius. That's the IPCC rule. And at the rate that we're burning, Bill McKibben did a study about in 2012. And what he did was he looked at, to stay below 2 degrees in 2012, how much carbon can we emit? And what he estimated was it was 565 billion tons. And we were emitting about 40 billion tons at the time. So if you divide that out, we had 18 years left of carbon emissions. And that was 9 years ago. So now we have 9 years left to basically stop emitting carbon. And that's the urgency of the problem. What we notice is that since we only have, So there's, of the greenhouse gases, each gas stays in the atmosphere for a certain amount of time. So methane is short-lived. So if you emit it, it breaks down in the atmosphere. But CO2 lasts like 500 or 1,000 years. So CO2, every molecule that you emit will continue to heat the planet. It will continue to trap the sun's energy for 500 years. But methane is gone in like 20 years. So if you look at the time scale, methane in the 20-year time scale is 80 times more potent than CO2. And that's the time scale that we should be looking at. So the emissions of methane are due to, the belching of cows, and due to rice, how we grow our rice, and other factors. So it's our food choices that can affect that methane, which has 80 times more potent than CO2. So getting rid of a lot of these ruminants that are emitting this methane would be a big benefit to the planet in that 20-year time scale.
Great, good, thank you. Just want to follow up with that. So I know that there's work from like Dr. Sailesh Rao with Climate Healers, and they even give a higher percentage. And so they look at something like in the mid 80% range, and you have 18%, 51% that you mentioned. And so I think a lot of it's also how you classify, and especially transportation, because some transportation is for food and all of that too. So what number do you use when you talk about this? What number do you put out there saying, animal agriculture is responsible for X percentage of greenhouse gas emissions?
Well, I use between 18 and 50%. And I just say that there's different studies, and I wouldn't go as far as 80%. I think, that is hard for people to accept.
Yeah, I think there's a little bit of shock value there, but there is good supporting evidence that it is a lot more than most people think, and that diet is such a big connection. So thanks for a lot of that information. Yeah.
And that's why food waste is a big problem, is because we waste a tremendous amount of food, and if we just stop that waste. And the other thing is that what people have estimated is if 33% of our animal protein went plant-based, we would not have to, even to feed we're at 7.8 billion people on the planet, even to go to 10 billion people, if we went to 33% of people converting to vegetarian diets, we would not have to burn any more rainforest. We would not have to take any more land away from production. And so part of the point of the Impossible Burger is that when you go to a restaurant and they're not providing very many vegan or vegetarian options, you should talk to them and say, you should have more vegan or vegetarian options on your menu. And, have you looked at these plant-based proteins? You're muted, Sarab.
Okay, thank you. Okay, let me take a question that Andrea has posed here. She says, what ideas do you have to help citizens of India to shift away from dairy toward veganism, considering cultural and religious reverence for cows' milk?
I think it's, making people aware. I mean, I think most Indian mothers think that they have to give their kids cow milk to make them grow up healthy and strong. And it's that education that we need to provide. I think the movie Game Changers was an eye-opener for a lot of people, to say you can have the world's strongest athletes from plant-based diets, fully vegan diets.
Great, okay. So another question here from MS. Besides the threats and cost of property, material goods, what are impacts to individual human health that are the biggest threats? More viruses? You mentioned this a bit, so just if you want to expand a little bit. viruses, compromised immunity, the vectors, disease vectors. Can you just talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so, well, I mean, the climate effects are here already. If we look at the wildfires, right? None of the kids could even go to school. We shut down the schools in the Bay Area, and then they stopped PE classes for weeks because of all the smoke. So the impacts of climate change are that wet areas will get wetter, and dry areas will get drier. So we basically live in a desert in California. And so our dry areas will get drier. Right now, if we look at it, we're in a pretty major drought this year. So, we're expecting that we're going to get more wildfires this year. But in terms of the disease vectors, I'll just give you one example, is that in the Rockies, they have all these pine trees, and there's a pine beetle that infests these pine trees. And in the winters, it gets cold enough that 90% of those pine beetles get frozen. And so that keeps the populations in check. But now the winters are not getting cold enough. So those pine beetle populations aren't getting hit. And so what's happening is there's huge areas of the Rockies that all the pine trees are dead. And that's a big wildfire risk. So we're seeing that all over the country. But then, we have these mosquitoes that can't survive in cold temperatures. In freezes, the mosquito larvae freeze and the mosquitoes freeze. But now, the freeze zones are moving further north with climate change. So in the United States, as it gets warmer and warmer, those mosquitoes can now survive in the United States. So now we're seeing dengue coming to the United States that we never saw in before.
Great, thank you, Sudhanshu. So I know there's so much more that can be asked and said about this, but I think we're going to turn it back over to JAINA. So again, thank you, Sudhanshu, and all the presenters, and JAINA for coordinating.